At 55, the hospital room becomes familiar. At 22, fast food feels harmless. At 55, machines quietly monitor every heartbeat. At 22, hours disappear in front of screens. At 55, even walking down a corridor feels heavy. At 22, cigarettes pass easily between friends. At 55, the cardiologist studies every report carefully. At 22, energy drinks feel like fuel. At 55, climbing stairs require effort. At 22, the elevator always feels easier. At 55, blood pressure numbers suddenly matter. At 22, burgers and fries feel normal. At 55, waiting rooms feel longer than ever. At 22, snacks fill every quiet moment. At 55, chest discomfort becomes a warning. At 22, binge watching replaces movement. At 55, the doctor explains the risks quietly. At 22, the gym membership collects dust. At 55, morning walks become necessary. At 22, fresh air feels optional. At 55, medicine organizers fill the table. At 22, late-night deliveries fill the stomach. At 55, tiredness arrives quickly. At 22, midnight pizza feels normal. At 55, medical reports bring uncomfortable truths. At 22, alcohol flows freely through the night. At 55, recovery after procedures takes time. At 22, cigarettes feel like relaxation. At 55, every step is counted carefully. At 22, fitness reminders are ignored. At 55, cholesterol numbers demand attention. At 22, fried food feels irresistible. At 55, exercise becomes doctor's advice. At 22, sleep schedules fall apart. At 55, health books replace entertainment. At 22, health warnings scroll past unnoticed. At 55, rehabilitation sessions begin. At 22, long hours sitting become routine. At 55, devices track every heartbeat. At 22, energy drinks push the body harder. At 55, resting after a short walk becomes normal. At 22, sports invitations are declined. At 55, the heart monitor becomes a companion. At 22, desserts appear every day. At 55, recovery rooms replace living rooms. At 22, instant noodles replace balanced meals. At 55, doctors supervise every movement. At 22, hours pass without standing up. At 55, chest pain becomes impossible to ignore. At 22, smoking feels casual. At 55, scans reveal what habits created. At 22, soda replaces water. At 55, hospital beds feel colder at night. At 22, junk food comforts every craving. At 55, medicine instructions fill the day. At 22, healthy meals feel inconvenient. At 55, even breathing after a walk feels heavy. At 22, gaming sessions last all day. At 55, surgery discussions become real. At 22, alcohol feels like celebration. At 55, the smartwatch warns constantly. At 22, those warnings are ignored. At 55, recovery rooms grow quiet at night. At 22, nights end with snacks. At 55, slow walks begin the morning. At 22, mornings start late. At 55, health seminars suddenly matter. At 22, advice sounds boring. At 55, energy disappears quickly. At 22, posture stays slouched for hours. At 55, nutritionists guide every meal. At 22, processed food fills the plate. At 55, hospital instructions become daily rules. At 22, cigarettes still light the night. At 55, gardens replace gyms. At 22, outdoor life feels optional. At 55, blood pressure checks start the morning. At 22, sugary drinks start the day. At 55, exhaustion arrives without warning. At 22, late-night eating feels harmless. At 55, cardiologists guide the future. At 22, health checkups are ignored. At 55, family walks beside you for support. At 22, healthy advice sounds distant. At 55, medicine bottles line the table. At 22, alcohol glasses fill the night. At 55, quiet hospital rooms invite reflection. At 22, laughter hides unhealthy choices. At 55, reports carry serious warnings. At 22, junk food wins again. At 55, doctor visits become routine. At 22, inactivity becomes habit. At 55, hospital corridors feel longer. At 22, exercise feels unnecessary. At 55, every step is careful. At 22, hours disappear on the phone. At 55, the heart monitor tells the truth. At 22, energy drinks hide the fatigue. At 55, heart problems feel sudden. At 22, they began quietly, one habit at a time.